Have you ever realized that the person who quietly changed your life disappeared long before you noticed they were gone? Every weekday morning at exactly 7:18, before downtown Chicago had fully shaken off the pale blue light of dawn, a single sheet of paper waited beneath the windshield wiper of a black Mercedes S-Class parked in the same reserved space outside Carter Global Holdings. No signature, no note, just another drawing. Sometimes it was a bright yellow sun smiling over tall buildings. Sometimes it was a little bird perched on the roof of a shiny car. Sometimes it showed a man in a dark business suit standing beneath a tree while a tiny girl held out a flower far too big for her hands. The drawings were made with inexpensive crayons, their colors slightly uneven, their corners curled from the morning dew, yet every line carried a warmth that didn't belong in a city built from steel, glass, and deadlines. Ethan Carter never saw who left them. By the time he arrived each morning with a cup of black coffee cooling between his fingers, the mysterious picture was already waiting. He would pause for only a second, glance around the nearly empty parking garage, then quietly remove the paper before anyone else noticed. His executive assistant believed he was checking the windshield for damage. The security guards assumed neighborhood children were playing harmless games. Ethan corrected no one. Without saying a word, he folded each drawing with remarkable care and slipped it into the leather portfolio he carried everywhere. It became a ritual neither he nor anyone else could explain. 39 mornings. 39 drawings. Every single one different. Every single one impossible to throw away. The CEO who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without changing his heartbeat somehow couldn't bring himself to discard a child's crayon sketch. Even he didn't understand why. There were mornings when board members waited upstairs, investors flew across the country to meet him, and markets opened with fortunes hanging in the balance. Yet for one quiet moment each day, nothing seemed more important than discovering what picture had appeared beneath his windshield. He never smiled when he found them. At least, not where anyone could see. But something almost invisible softened in his eyes before the expression disappeared beneath the familiar mask of discipline that had made him one of the youngest CEOs in America. Then, on the 40th morning, he reached for the windshield wiper exactly as he always had. His fingers touched nothing except cold glass. He frowned and searched the hood of the car. Nothing. He looked beneath the tires, around the parking space, even toward the concrete pillars stretching through the silent garage. There was no drawing, no little sun, no birds, no smiling stick figures. Only an empty windshield reflecting the gray morning sky. For reasons he couldn't explain, the silence inside that parking garage felt louder than the traffic outside. And for the first time in years, Ethan Carter found himself hoping a stranger he had never met would simply come back tomorrow. Ethan Carter had spent 20 years building a life where nothing happened by accident. Every minute on his calendar belonged somewhere. Every meeting had a purpose. Every conversation ended with a decision. His mornings began at exactly 5:30, when the alarm sounded before the first hint of sunrise. He ran 4 miles along the quiet path beside Lake Michigan, returned to the penthouse overlooking the river, prepared the same breakfast of oatmeal, fresh berries, and black coffee, then reviewed financial reports while the city slowly came alive beneath his windows. From the outside, it looked like discipline. From the inside, it felt more like silence with a schedule. The apartment reflected the same careful order. The marble counters remained spotless. The books sat perfectly aligned. A grand piano stood near the living room windows, polished every week although no one had touched its keys in nearly 6 years. Framed photographs were strangely absent. Visitors often admired the breathtaking skyline without noticing that nothing inside the home suggested anyone had ever laughed there. Success had filled every corner except the ones that mattered most. His employees respected him because he was fair. Investors trusted him because he never acted on emotion. Newspapers called him visionary, relentless, impossible to distract. None of them realized that distraction was exactly what he had spent years avoiding. Work had become the safest place to hide from memories that still arrived without warning, usually in the quiet moments between meetings or during long elevator rides when there was nothing left to think about except the past. That was why he always parked in the same reserved space. The routine required no decisions. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his suit jacket, carried his coffee through the lobby, greeted the same receptionist, nodded to the same security officers, and disappeared into the elevator before most employees arrived. It was a life built from repetition, predictable enough that no unexpected feeling could find its way inside. Or at least that had been true until the drawings appeared. He never mentioned them. Yet every evening before leaving the office, he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and carefully placed the newest picture on top of the growing stack. Sometimes, after everyone else had gone home, he found himself looking through them one by one. There was something strangely comforting about the bright colors. One picture showed a tiny red umbrella standing beside a businessman in the rain. Another showed autumn leaves swirling around two smiling figures sharing a park bench. None of the drawings were technically perfect, but every one of them carried an optimism that felt untouched by disappointment. Ethan caught himself wondering what kind of child believed every cloudy day deserved a rainbow somewhere in the corner. He would shake his head, close the folder, and tell himself it was meaningless. Yet the next morning, he always walked toward his car with just a little more curiosity than the day before. By the time the 40th morning arrived without a single drawing waiting beneath the windshield wiper, the absence felt impossible to ignore. It was remarkable how quickly a stranger's quiet kindness had become part of the rhythm of a man who believed he needed nothing from anyone. The empty windshield greeted Ethan again the following morning, and somehow that unsettled him even more than it had the day before. He stood beside the car for several quiet seconds before finally walking toward the lobby, but instead of pressing the elevator button immediately, he glanced back across the parking garage as though expecting someone to appear from behind one of the concrete columns. No one did. Throughout the morning, numbers filled conference room screens, executives debated expansion plans, and attorneys reviewed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet Ethan found himself distracted by something no spreadsheet could explain. During a short break between meetings, he unlocked the drawer beneath his desk and spread every drawing across the polished walnut surface. 39 pictures formed an unexpected story when placed side by side. At first they seemed random, but now he noticed patterns he had overlooked. The smiling businessman always wore a navy blue suit just like his own. The shiny black sedan appeared in nearly every picture. The little girl gradually stood closer to the man with each drawing. In the earliest sketches, she waved from across the street. A week later, she appeared beside a flower bed. Later, she stood only a few feet away, holding balloons, feeding birds, carrying an umbrella, building a snowman, or simply smiling while the businessman looked toward the sunrise. Ethan gently picked up the very first drawing. In one corner was a tiny yellow butterfly that he had never paid attention to before. Curious, he searched the others. Every single picture contained the same butterfly, always hidden somewhere different. It felt less like coincidence and more like a quiet signature. His fingertips paused over the rough crayon texture, and for the first time he wondered not why someone had left the drawings, but whether they had hoped he would eventually notice the tiny details they had carefully added. Late that afternoon, as employees began leaving for the day, Ethan walked downstairs instead of asking his driver to bring the car to the entrance. Near the security desk sat Harold Benson, the 70-year-old parking attendant who had worked in the building longer than anyone else. Harold looked up with surprise because the CEO rarely stopped to chat. Ethan hesitated before asking the question that had quietly occupied his thoughts all day. "Harold, have you ever seen a child around the garage early in the mornings?" The older man adjusted his glasses and thought for a moment before slowly nodding. "A little blonde girl, maybe 7 years old. She usually walks through here just after 7. Always carrying a sketchbook. Sweet kid. Never causes trouble." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken ever so slightly. "Do you know where she goes?" Harold smiled gently. "Not exactly. She always comes from the direction of St. Margaret Children's Hospital about 2 blocks away. She never stays more than a minute. Leaves as quietly as she arrived." Ethan turned toward the large glass doors facing the street. Beyond them, the evening sun reflected across the windows of the hospital in soft shades of gold. Until that moment, the mysterious artist had existed only through bright crayons and folded paper. Now she was suddenly real, walking somewhere in the same city, carrying the same sketchbook, while the only person who had silently looked forward to her drawings every morning had never even learned her name. The next morning, Ethan left home 15 minutes earlier than usual, although he told himself it was simply to avoid traffic. Deep down, he knew that was not the reason. As his car rolled into the familiar parking garage at exactly 7 o'clock, the concrete levels echoed with the distant hum of ventilation fans and the occasional footsteps of early employees. He parked in the reserved space but did not step out immediately. Instead, he remained behind the steering wheel, watching the entrance reflected in the side mirror. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. At precisely 7:12, a tiny figure appeared at the far end of the garage. She wore a light blue sweater beneath a faded cream jacket that was one size too large, and a small backpack rested against her shoulders. Blonde curls peeked out from beneath a knitted beanie, and tucked carefully under one arm was a worn sketchbook with colored pencils sticking out from the top. She walked with quiet purpose, glancing around to make certain no one was watching. Ethan instinctively lowered himself slightly in his seat, not wanting to frighten her. She reached his car, smiled to herself, and gently slipped a folded drawing beneath the windshield wiper. Before turning away, she softly placed the palm of her hand against the hood for only a second, almost as if greeting an old friend. Then she hurried back toward the hospital without ever looking behind her. Ethan remained perfectly still until she disappeared through the garage entrance. Only then did he step outside. His hands moved much slower than usual as he unfolded the newest picture. This one showed a businessman sitting alone on a park bench beneath a gray sky. Standing beside him was the little girl, holding out a bright yellow balloon. Above them floated the familiar butterfly, larger than before, its wings stretching across the corner of the page. Ethan found himself smiling before he even realized he was doing it. It was small, uncertain, and gone almost immediately, but it was the first genuine smile he had felt in longer than he cared to remember. He looked toward the street where the little girl had disappeared, then carefully folded the drawing and slipped it inside his portfolio. That afternoon, instead of returning directly home after work, Ethan stopped at a neighborhood art supply store for the first time in his life. The young cashier helped him choose a box of professional colored pencils, thick drawing paper, and a hardcover sketchbook with bright blue binding. Back at the garage early the following morning, he placed the unopened package beside the parking space with a simple handwritten card that read, "For the wonderful artist who brightens someone's mornings. Thank you." Then he parked several spaces away and waited. When the little girl arrived, she immediately noticed the gift. She looked around with wide blue eyes, uncertain whether it truly belonged to her. Slowly she picked up the box, read the note twice, and hugged the sketchbook tightly against her chest. She did not speak because there was no one there to hear her, but the radiant smile that spread across her face carried more gratitude than words ever could. Before leaving, she carefully tucked another folded drawing beneath the windshield wiper. This time, in the corner beside the butterfly, she had added something new. A tiny red heart, no bigger than a dime. For the next 2 weeks, an invisible friendship quietly settled into the rhythm of their mornings. Ethan no longer pretended he arrived early because of traffic, and Sophie no longer hurried away quite as quickly as before. She still never waited to meet him face to face, but her footsteps became a little slower each day, as though she had begun trusting that the person behind the note truly appreciated what she created. The drawings changed after the new sketchbook arrived. The colors became richer, the pages brighter, the tiny details more confident. One morning, she drew the businessman feeding squirrels in a city park while the little girl laughed from a nearby fountain. Another day, they stood together beneath a sky filled with colorful kites drifting above the Chicago skyline. Every picture still included the little butterfly, but now the tiny red heart appeared beside it as well, quietly becoming part of their unspoken language. Ethan found himself looking forward to those few silent moments more than any board meeting waiting upstairs. Even the people around him noticed subtle changes they could not explain. His assistant was surprised when he complimented an intern's presentation instead of simply approving it. He paused to thank the janitor who polished the executive hallway every evening. One afternoon, he even accepted an invitation to have lunch with department managers instead of eating alone in his office. No dramatic transformation had taken place. He was still disciplined, still thoughtful, still respected. Yet the invisible walls surrounding him had begun to crack just enough for kindness to slip through. One Friday evening, before leaving the office, Ethan carefully purchased a small wooden picture frame. He placed inside it the very first drawing Sophie had ever left beneath his windshield. Instead of locking it inside his desk drawer, he carried it home and set it on the bookshelf beside the silent piano. The apartment immediately felt different. Not because the room had changed, but because, for the first time in years, something inside it carried evidence of another human heart. On Saturday morning, he caught himself sitting beside the window with a cup of coffee, studying the framed drawing while sunlight slowly filled the room. He wondered whether Sophie knew how much happiness she had quietly delivered without ever asking for anything in return. Monday arrived, and he smiled before stepping out of the elevator, already imagining what colorful surprise might be waiting downstairs that evening when he returned to his car. But when the workday ended and he reached the garage, there was nothing beneath the windshield wiper. He assumed she had simply been busy. Tuesday morning arrived with the same empty space. Wednesday passed the same way. By Thursday, Ethan no longer walked directly into the building. Instead, he lingered beside the parking space, looking toward the entrance leading to St. Margaret Children's Hospital. Harold noticed him standing there and quietly approached. The older man rested one hand on the handle of his broom before speaking softly. "You are waiting for the little artist, are you not?" Ethan nodded without looking away from the doorway. Harold sighed gently. "I have not seen her all week. One of the nurses mentioned that she has been staying inside the hospital with her mother. I do not know anything more than that." Ethan stared toward the hospital across the street as a cool autumn breeze drifted through the garage entrance. For the first time since those drawings had entered his life, he realized that someone who had become part of his heart might need someone to show up for hers. The following morning, Ethan canceled his first meeting for the first time in nearly 3 years. His assistant looked surprised, but wisely asked no questions as he walked out of the office carrying a simple brown leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. Inside were every drawing Sophie had ever given him, each one carefully protected in clear sleeves as though they belonged in a museum instead of a desk drawer. He crossed the street toward St. Margaret Children's Hospital, where parents carried balloons, volunteers pushed small carts filled with books, and children smiled through windows decorated with colorful paper stars. It was a place filled with hope that quietly existed beside uncertainty. Ethan paused just inside the entrance, suddenly realizing he had no idea how to find the little girl who had slowly become part of his daily life. At the reception desk, he politely introduced himself and explained that he was searching for a young artist named Sophie. The volunteer behind the counter smiled with immediate recognition. "You must be the man with the black Mercedes," she said softly. Ethan blinked in surprise. "She talked about me?" The woman nodded. "Almost every day." She picked up the telephone, spoke quietly for a moment, then gestured toward a family waiting area overlooking a small indoor garden. "Someone would like to meet you." A few moments later, a kind nurse approached with gentle eyes and introduced herself as Emily Lawson. She led Ethan to a quiet corner where sunlight filtered through tall windows onto rows of green plants. "Sophie's mother has been receiving treatment here for several months," Emily explained. "Sophie spends nearly every afternoon drawing while she waits. She says it helps her believe tomorrow will always come." Ethan listened silently, his eyes drifting toward dozens of children's drawings hanging across one wall. Rainbows, butterflies, smiling families, bright balloons, and handwritten messages covered nearly every inch of space. Then he noticed something familiar. Tucked between two larger paintings was a tiny yellow butterfly drawn in crayon, exactly the same one that appeared in every picture Sophie had left for him. Emily smiled when she saw him recognize it. "That butterfly is her little promise," she said. "She tells the younger children that butterflies always remind us to keep looking forward because they never stay in one place forever." Ethan swallowed quietly. "Why did she leave drawings on my car?" The nurse's expression softened even more. She used to watch people walking into the office building from the hospital window while her mother rested. One morning, she noticed that everyone smiled at someone except one man. She asked one of our volunteers who you were. After that, she began saying, "He looks lonely. Maybe he just needs someone to remember him before work." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the portfolio in his hands. For several long seconds, he could not speak. He had believed those drawings were gifts of kindness from a child. He had never imagined they had begun because a 7-year-old girl had quietly noticed the loneliness he had spent years hiding from the rest of the world. In that peaceful hospital waiting room, surrounded by children's artwork and morning sunlight. Ethan understood something no business achievement had ever taught him. The smallest hearts often see what the busiest eyes completely miss. Emily led Ethan down a quiet hallway where afternoon sunlight spilled across polished floors in long golden rectangles. Children's laughter drifted faintly from a nearby playroom, blending with the gentle hum of conversations and the distant melody of someone softly playing piano in the hospital lobby. They stopped outside a small art room with wide glass windows. Inside, several children sat around a large table covered with paper, markers, and colored pencils. Near the far corner, Sophie sat alone, completely focused on the page in front of her. She had not noticed anyone watching. Her blonde curls fell across one side of her face as she carefully shaded the wings of another butterfly with bright yellow and orange pencils. Emily smiled warmly. She comes here whenever her mother is resting. Drawing makes the waiting feel shorter. Ethan remained still, suddenly uncertain how to begin a conversation he had imagined for weeks. Before he could speak, Sophie happened to glance toward the window. The moment her blue eyes met his, her pencil stopped moving. Surprise spread across her face, followed almost instantly by uncertainty. She slowly climbed down from her chair and walked toward the doorway, stopping a few feet away. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sophie looked down at her shoes and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Did you find the note?" Ethan nodded. Gently. "I did." She twisted her fingers together. "I thought maybe you did not like my drawings anymore, because I had to stop bringing them." Ethan carefully opened the leather portfolio he had carried into the hospital. One by one, he removed the drawings, placing them across a nearby table until every colorful page formed a bright mosaic between them. Sophie's eyes grew wider with each picture. She looked from the drawings to Ethan, unable to believe what she was seeing. "You kept them?" she whispered. Ethan smiled, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Every single one." Sophie slowly reached toward the first drawing she had ever made, gently touching the corner where the tiny butterfly rested. "I thought you probably threw them away after work," she admitted. "I only wanted your mornings to feel happier before your meetings." Ethan felt an unexpected lump rise in his throat. "Those drawings became the best part of my mornings." Sophie looked up, her expression filled with innocent disbelief. "Really?" He nodded without hesitation. "You changed something inside me, Sophie. You probably did not even know you were doing it." A quiet smile slowly appeared across her face, brighter than any color in her sketchbook. She reached into the pocket of her backpack and carefully unfolded one final drawing that had been protected inside a clear plastic folder. "I was saving this one," she said. "I wanted to give it to you when Mom felt better and I could come back outside." Ethan accepted the page with both hands. It showed the familiar businessman standing beside the little girl beneath a wide blue sky. This time, they were not facing away from each other. They stood side by side, smiling as dozens of yellow butterflies filled the air above them. Beneath the picture, written carefully in uneven but determined handwriting, were words that made Ethan's eyes quietly fill with tears. They simply read, "You smile more now." Over the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself visiting St. Margaret Children's Hospital far more often than anyone expected, including himself. Some afternoons he arrived carrying fresh sketchbooks, boxes of colored pencils, or books filled with beautiful illustrations. Other days he brought nothing except time, which Sophie seemed to treasure even more. They would sit together in the art room where sunlight painted gentle patterns across the tables, quietly drawing side by side, while neither felt any pressure to fill every silence with words. Sophie talked about butterflies because she believed they reminded people that change could be beautiful instead of frightening. She explained that every butterfly in her pictures represented hope traveling from one person to another. Ethan listened carefully, realizing that a child barely 7 years old understood something he had spent decades overlooking. Hope grew stronger only when it was shared. One afternoon, Sophie asked if he had ever learned to play the piano standing untouched inside his apartment. Ethan looked surprised before smiling. "How did you know I have a piano?" She giggled softly and pointed to one of her older drawings that he had brought back to show her. In the corner, behind the businessman, she had drawn a tall apartment window with a piano inside. "I imagined lonely people always have music waiting for them," she said simply. That evening, Ethan returned home, walked directly to the instrument, and gently lifted the cover, hiding the keys. Dust had settled lightly across the polished wood, but when he pressed the first note, its warm sound echoed through rooms that had been silent for years. He did not play perfectly. He barely remembered how. Yet for the first time since losing the life he once knew, the apartment no longer sounded empty. A few days later, Sophie's mother, Claire Bennett, felt well enough to spend a short afternoon in the hospital garden. Ethan finally met the woman whose quiet courage had inspired so many of Sophie's smiles. Claire thanked him with tears glistening gently in her eyes, but Ethan shook his head. "Your daughter believed she was helping a stranger," he said softly. "She ended up giving me my life back." Claire smiled knowingly. She always notices people who think no one sees them. Before leaving that afternoon, Sophie reached into her backpack one more time. She carefully unfolded another drawing unlike any she had made before. There was no businessman standing alone, no little girl waiting nearby, no gray sky slowly turning blue. Instead, the page showed a large community filled with children, families, trees, music, and butterflies floating above smiling faces of every age. Near the center stood a familiar man holding open a door, while children carrying sketchbooks happily walked inside. Ethan looked closely before noticing the small handwritten sentence beneath the picture. It read, "When one person feels remembered, they help someone else remember too." He held the page quietly, understanding that the drawings had never truly been about a parked car or a busy executive. They had always been gentle invitations to keep opening the heart a little wider than the day before. Looking at Sophie's hopeful smile beneath the golden afternoon sunlight, Ethan realized the greatest masterpieces were never framed on gallery walls. Sometimes they arrived folded beneath a windshield wiper, carrying enough kindness to redraw an entire life. 1 year later, the parking garage beneath Carter Global Holdings looked almost the same, yet everything that truly mattered had changed. Employees still hurried toward elevators with steaming coffee cups, security guards still greeted familiar faces, and Ethan still arrived early every weekday morning. But his first stop was no longer his office. Instead, he crossed the street to St. Margaret Children's Hospital before every workday began. There, laughter drifted from a bright new art studio filled with easels, shelves of sketchbooks, colorful paints, and sunlight pouring through wide windows. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign that read, "The Butterfly Studio." Ethan had quietly funded every brush, every table, every class, and every scholarship without placing his own name anywhere inside the room. When reporters asked why he had donated so much, he simply smiled and answered, "Because someone once reminded me that hope is meant to be shared." Sophie stood near the center of the studio on opening day, now healthier, brighter, and smiling with the same quiet kindness that had first appeared in her drawings. Claire stood beside her, stronger with every passing month, watching children eagerly fill blank pages with dreams only they could imagine. Before the ribbon was cut, Sophie tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve and handed him one final folded picture. He unfolded it carefully, just as he had done so many mornings before. This drawing was different from all the others. There was no businessman, no little girl, no parked car. Instead, dozens of children filled the page together, each holding a crayon, while bright yellow butterflies floated across a wide blue sky. In one corner stood a grand piano with its lid open. Through tall windows, warm light poured into the room, reaching every smiling face. Beneath the picture, Sophie had written one final sentence in careful handwriting. "Thank you for opening the door after you opened your heart." Ethan looked at the drawing for a long moment before quietly placing it beside the very first picture she had ever left for him, both preserved inside matching frames that would hang forever at the entrance to the studio. Every child who walked through those doors would see them side by side, not as expensive artwork, but as proof that kindness never needs permission to begin. Months later, employees noticed another small tradition quietly taking shape. Every Friday morning, blank sheets of drawing paper appeared on a table in the company lobby. Children visiting the building with their families were invited to leave pictures for anyone who might need a reason to smile. Soon the walls filled with rainbows, butterflies, balloons, trees, families, and handwritten messages of encouragement. Executives paused to read them before meetings. Visitors smiled as they walked through the entrance. The building itself seemed warmer than it had ever been before. Ethan sometimes stood quietly at the edge of the lobby, watching strangers smile at drawings created by children they would never meet. He finally understood that true success could never be measured by stock prices, office towers, or awards displayed behind polished glass. The greatest legacy a person could leave behind was the simple decision to notice someone who believed they had become invisible. And somewhere among hundreds of colorful pictures, a tiny yellow butterfly still appeared in every collection, gently reminding everyone who saw it that sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the one that redraws an entire life.